All right, good evening, everybody. Did you fix that? There is one paper left. Who gets it? We have one that was, if you didn't get one, does anybody need one? Kelly has it if you need it. Anyone? Going once? Going twice? Everybody got their papers? Woo-hoo! Y'all, well, if I was a betting man, I'd probably ought to go buy a lottery ticket now, right? Just kidding. Okay, question. If you were to go, you know how you watch the news sometimes and they have the man on the street asking questions? You guys ever seen those things? Sometimes they ask trivia and people as a whole are really not that smart. They don't know things that they ought to know, right? You're like, really? You don't know George Washington is? Well, then they ask other things that have to do with maybe moral issues or things and thoughts of the day about this or that or what ought to be or what should be. What do you think, if we were to put man or woman on the street with a microphone, camera, and go ask around, what, based on what's going on in our society right now, what is the greatest problem, or what is the cause of the ills of our society today? What would they say is the number one cause, the root cause of the ills of our society today? What kind of answers do you think you'd get? Okay, race. Okay, so you think that would come up on the street in our society today? So that's the issue, but what would be the cause according to that? Poverty? Okay, poverty might be. Okay, all interesting. So those are issues. Okay, so the cause might be white supremacy. You hear the cause there? Do you think you might get that answer on the street today? About what the real cause of our nation, our world's ills? What else might be the cause of these things that they might bring up? Hatred and intolerance, right? That's the cause. Might you hear the word oppression? That people are oppressed. Okay, if you were to ask, okay, so you said uneducated, so lack of education. But most likely, what would they mean? Education according to what? Yeah, to whatever they think is what you need to be educated on. See, I know what you're thinking. Right. But I'm saying the general answer on the street. If we ran into Danny Kelly on the street, I know the answer that I'm going to get about the root cause of things. But the root cause of our world's problems and ills. So, what's that? Oh yeah, inequality, right? So oppression, inequality, inequity, right? Okay. Yep. So you might hear things along those lines and a lot, but really, when we think about it, and so if those are the answers, if white supremacy is the root cause, if oppressions is the root cause, then the answer to that question is, then what needs to be fixed? You see what I'm saying? Is that what someone on the street's going to say? Right. They're going to say that we need to fix those things, right? And right now, that seems to be the answer to every question. And particularly, though, remember, go back to our study of the axes, right? Of the what we were called intersectionality. So we would have the oppressed and the oppressor. Right? The oppressor and the oppressed, they would set it up on an axis, right? About each one of these categories. And so what needs to be fixed and what's being portrayed in our society and taught in our schools is that the oppressor must be taken down. They are the problem. That is the root cause. And so the reason that we're studying this is because this worldview, which is permeating every aspect of our society, says this is the solution. Now, I had a friend of mine send me an ad this week. It was a commercial. And I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but if you watch commercials these days, you're going to find something very conspicuous in its absence. Anybody know what that is? When you watch a commercial, you're going to find something very conspicuously absent in 99% of those commercials. Anybody know what it is? Don't you say you already know. Don't cheat. You're smart. Right? You will not see white males unless they're holding another white male or black or someone else, and unless they're homosexual, then you will see it. Am I right? This was a commercial for Disney's 50th anniversary. Every subgroup was represented, except there was no white males anywhere in there, because right now the ultimate evil in Western society, and in fact they would say the world, is the white male. You are the problem. You are the oppressor. And it must be, you must be taken down. And especially if you're a Christian. Because the Christian takes things even further than just being a white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual, all those things, remember? You add to that one who holds to a certain moral standard based on God's Word, then you're really an oppressor, which we'll talk about. So here's the thing, though. In that system, in that worldview, that's the problem, and that's what needs to be fixed. In a biblical worldview, the problem is what? Sin. Now, if sin is the problem, what's the solution? It's Jesus. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? That's the solution. Now, so that being said, that's one of the things we're going to be branching off here as we look into this idea of the awfulness of sin. Now, tonight's going to not so much deal with the problem and the solution, but it's going to deal with the perspective of sin that it hit me like a ton of bricks. Maybe you've thought of it this way before, but between you and me and Facebook and the whole world, I was weeping at my desk. It hits you like a ton of bricks when you think about it like this. And this is a powerful thing. And so I hope that it resonates with you too. So in today's world, people do not like the word sin. You can speak of law breaking, wrongdoing, crime, error, antisocial behavior, shortcomings, corruption, irresponsibility, selfishness, misdeeds, vice, and evil, but don't call it sin. Why not? Why can't we use that word in society? Why are you not going to hear that in the news? Why might you hear all those other words, but not the word sin? What do you think? Okay, that means there's a higher... So the word sin means there's a higher power? What do you mean? Okay. Okay, you're absolutely on the right track. Anybody want to build on her thought? Okay. The word sin, because of the way it's been used in the vernacular over the years, it's a religious word. It's a church word. It brings to mind accountability and thoughts of religious things, right? It has religious overtones. And so you can use other words, but don't use sin because of these things. Why can we not use this? Because sin has an unmistakable religious overtones, conjuring up the face of God and the law of God. Sin, this word, it suggests that our negative behavior is in a real sense a violation of the law of God. And the one thing modern man does not want to do is to think that his behavior has anything to do with God. Even if we use the word sin, For most people, it is not sin against God. In our time, you can sin against animals, right? What do they mean by that? Yeah, you can sin against animals, right? Yeah. Hamburgers. You can sin against trees. You can sin against the environment as such. You can sin against yourself. You can sin against other individuals or groups of individuals, the poor, women, children. You can sin against races of people, but in today's world, not against God. That's not a common idea. Here's the deal. Sin really is not sin unless it is understood as a violation of the laws of the Creator. Then and only then is it sin. Sin is not sin unless it is sin against God. As the psalmist David said, as you notice the verse that is at the top of our lesson, right? Against thee and thee only I have sinned. This is the most important thing I can tell you about the awfulness of sin. It is sin against God. In fact, sin devastates God. The whole idea that something we human beings do can affect God in a way has been widely denied. Okay, so let's think about this. Are there any religious systems that are in place today within Christianity that would say that what we do really doesn't affect God? Have you ever really thought about this? Can you think of anything where they might say that God's going to be what He is, God's going to do what He's going to do, God's going to think what He's going to think, He's going to feel what He's going to feel regardless of what we say or do as creatures? Are there any systems out there that might... This is a little deeper into the pool here. Okay, the Calvinists, right? Now, if you recall in our studies about Calvinism, did you guys say it over here? Don't be afraid, right? In Calvinism, what is the ultimate goal? What is the ultimate attribute? What is the ultimate priority? What is the number one thing that everything gets filtered through? God's what? Not His grace. In Calvinism? Selection. That's the number one thing that's over every other idea that gets filtered through. His mercy. You were onto it. There we go. God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty, right? Everybody understand the concept of sovereignty? It means that He is, remember we use these terms, completely in every aspect non-contingent. Contingent means that you have reactions. Can God react? He can. They say no. Because that would make Him subject to what you do.
Well, how do they feel about prayer?
He causes it. It's causation. They deal with it in a causal effect. That God, in some form or fashion, causes everything, including what you think and feel. Therefore, He's not reacting, He's only acting. Now, listen to this and see how this plays out when we talk about the way that our sin affects God. This is important because there's some out there that say that in a certain way it really doesn't. Listen. The whole idea that something we human beings do can affect God in a way has been widely denied. For example, representatives of the pagan philosophy called Epicureanism. You guys remember Epicureanism in the Bible? If you look in Acts 17:18, anybody remember what the Epicureans kind of their philosophy was? I'm sorry, what? Possibly, but what was their philosophy? Donnie, did I see your hand? Yeah, eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow we... Right. So the philosophy is pretty much anything goes. Well, why do they say that? Donnie, you're on fire. I appreciate it. Right. So in Epicureanism, that's what they thought. They did not agree that any gods exist at all. But those who said they do exist thought of them as having no contact whatsoever with our world. As one writer put it, for the Epicureans, quote, the gods are completely separate from the rest of reality. They are uninterested in it, play no role in it, and remain completely undisturbed by it. A similar view is present sometimes within the boundaries of Christendom. In fact, a main doctrine of classical Calvinism is that the sovereign God never reacts and never responds to anything outside of himself, which does make the concept of prayer kind of hard for us. Why do we do it? You're right. There's many things within this discussion of free will and God's sovereignty. Well, it was an act, and it was an act rather than a reaction. It was planned and predestined and caused. They look at it in that view, which is problematic. We all recognize that. So, God always acts. He never reacts, they say. This applies to everything, including sin itself. I call this aspect of Calvinism the principle of unconditionality, right? This is the idea of contingency and non-contingency, conditionality and unconditionality. Meaning, example, Calvinists cannot bring themselves to admit that anything in God's experience can be conditioned or contingent upon man and can be a reaction to something in the creation. If you want to know more about this, I can give you some things to read that he lists here. Now, we say that such an idea like this is quite false. However, God interacts with human beings and responds to our actions because that is the way. See, here's the thing. Yes, God is sovereign, but he chose to create a world in which he would respond and react to his free will creatures. Okay? So that is the way he sovereignly chose to make us, with free will. And if we do indeed have true free will, then there has to be a reaction or a response to the actions of free will creatures in the course of time. Right? So we say that as time progresses, that we all act and do things and we choose our actions freely, then as these things unfold, then God would interact with them. Everybody with me? So this is an aspect of the self-limitation under which God chose to relate to us when he decided to create us with relative independence. Our free will choices affect God in many ways, and nothing affects him more than our sin. In fact, our sin has a profound effect upon God. It devastates him. It tears him apart. It cuts him to the heart. We can affirm without hesitation that sin causes God untold pain. We have superstitions about such things on a human level, right? In occult circles, people, they jab voodoo dolls with pins thinking it causes pain in others. When walking down the sidewalk, children used to cite the rhyme, step on a break your mother's back. The fact is that many of the things we do cause great pain and anguish for loved ones. See the devastation caused by unfaithful spouses or drunken parents and disobedient children. He said, when I was a boy and had disobeyed my parents, I knew that I was causing them heartache. He says, I could see the pain in my mother's eyes. This is no less true in our relation to God. We cannot see God's eyes and the pain in them, but the fact is this: our every sin causes him pain, sin is a wound in the heart of God. I think you clearly see where this is going now. And I just want to ask at this point, you can think introspectively. And this was a little bit of a wake-up call for me in my thinking. Because when we talk about our sin, we normally talk about it as a whole, a concept. Right? We say that we're sinners. We say that we sin. We're going to talk about this here in a little bit. But if we put it in the perspective of what we're understanding right here and right now, we think of every single time we sin that it devastates him and that it's a wound in his heart, at least for me. I don't know that we really think of it that way. And if you're a parent, and the examples that he uses here, it makes real sense. Some Christian theologians have decided that God is so unchangeable or immutable that he simply cannot suffer in any sense. They call this God's impassibility, from the Latin word meaning to suffer, meaning he can't suffer. Do we have any evidence that God does suffer? Okay. What? Okay. Keep going. You guys are bringing out some good ones. Go back early. Do we have any evidence? Okay. Say it again. How do you feel about that? With Noah, what happened with Noah? What did it say? He was sorry. Now, and it says he was grieved in his heart. Well, is that not real? Is that just, does that verse mean anything? Was God truly heartbroken? Yes. You think it was an easy decision for him when he told Noah to start building the ark? You think that was, because he knew once that started, then he knew where this was all going. God knows, but what we're going to have to wipe out everybody but 8? He was devastated, heartbroken, pierced in his heart. I don't know if we think of it in this sense. See, in Jeremiah 31, let's back up. In Genesis 6:6, when we talk about the impassibility or the fact that God cannot suffer, this is wrong. In Genesis 6:6 declares, the Lord was grieved that he had made man on earth, and his heart was filled with pain. The New American Standard says he was grieved in his heart. In Jeremiah 31:20, God says this, is Ephraim my dear son? Is he a delightful child? Indeed, as often as I have spoken against him, I certainly still remember him. Therefore, my heart yearns for him. The lament of God literally says at the end, and this is an unusual statement, but if you understand the Jewish mind and the language, when it says that his bowels or his stomach, see, that was the seat of the person's emotions and heart, was the bowels. Truth be told, where do you feel your emotions? Right? And it says, my bowels moan, groan, ache for him. In Isaiah 63:10, they rebelled and grieved his Holy Spirit. In Luke 19:31 says of Jesus, and when he approached, he saw the city, and he wept over it. Here we see the awfulness of sin and how it causes infinite pain in the heart of God. And from this point on, we'll explain 2 ways in which sin causes agony in God. The first one is this. Okay, so in the introduction, everybody up to speed? Anybody need any blanks? Okay, let's just go through them, okay? The first one, people do not like the word sin. Sin has unmistakable religious overtones. Point B, that his behavior has anything to do with God. Point C, it is understood as a violation of the law. Again in point C, sin against God. Point D, Calvinist cannot bring themselves. God interacts there, and number 1 under point D, God interacts with human beings and responds to our actions. E, that sin causes God untold pain, and sin is a wound in the heart of God. Okay, everybody good? So now we look at this concept that sin violates the love of God. Violates the love of God. Sin devastates God simply because He is the kind of God that He is. We are familiar with 1 John 4:8 affirms, namely, God is love, God loves us. And when we sin against God, we sin against His love for us. If God were any other kind of God, sin would not be so awful. At least from God's standpoint. If God did not love us so much, maybe sin would not be so bad. The fact is that biblical concept of God is unique in revealing Him to us as a God of love. No other concepts of God, those based on human imagination and speculation, portray the deity as a loving being. Think about all the other deities that are out there, right? We don't see this concept of God as a God of love. One theologian says that love as a divine attribute is the Christian specialty. Another says that the affirmation, God is love, would sound hollow if we tried to apply it to other so-called deities of the world. To say that sin would hurt a non-loving God simply would not make sense. Remove love from the equation and say that all the other attributes of God exist but not love. Would sin be a big issue? Probably not. Wouldn't be the same. In stories and movies, rebellion against a bully or a heartless tyrant like Adolf Hitler or Pol Pot or Saddam Hussein is looked at as a noble act. And so also, if the deity were mean and heartless, it might be even admirable to sin and rebel against them. But He is not this kind of deity. The God of the Bible, the true God, is a loving Father who lavishes His goodness upon us and wants to bless us with all the blessings His power and glory can muster. We are His children, whom He wants to embrace close to His heart. Thus, when we sin, we are rebelling against His love and injuring and wounding Him in His heart. Every sin is like a slap in the face of the God who loves you. And this is why sin devastates God. Whenever anyone is rejected by someone he or she loves, the pain is inevitable. See the picture God draws of Himself in relation to rebellious Israel. Quote, I permitted myself, He is saying, myself, God, to be sought by those who did not ask for me. I permitted myself to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation which did not call on my name. I have spread out my hands all day long to a rebellious people who walk in the way which is not good, following their own thoughts. You can imagine. The tears running down God's face as He recites these words. Now think about this. You can see those same tears on Jesus' face when he says this about his people Israel. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. In another place, Jesus is specifically said to weep over the holy city. Often we wonder why sin, and often we wonder why we sin. And we wonder, how could we ever reach some mental state where we could just automatically say no? Would there ever be a point, would there ever be a way that we could condition ourselves to where we would automatically say no at the thought of temptation and sin? What thoughts could be so powerful that they could motivate us to resist sin and yield in obedience to God? And if this doesn't bring new light to this verse, I don't know what does. Because Jesus said it best. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Now think about this. If you understand that sin devastates God, that it pierces him in his heart, that it is an infinite wound upon him, and Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. It's powerful. Why is this? Because if we love him, we will not want to hurt him. This is why we must fully grasp the concept that sin devastates God. How can we bear to hurt the one we love? Let's press on here. When I was a young boy, this is a powerful. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this reference that he makes here, but if you are, this is very fascinating. And it's powerful. It says he found some books in Grandma Mitchell's house that he just devoured. One was Robin Hood. I could not bear it. In the end, when Robin Hood shot an arrow as far away as he could and instructed his followers to bury him where it landed, quote, and there they buried bold Robin Hood. So sad. But another book was even harder to put down. This is the part. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. The opening line is, "Please, sir, is this Plumfield?" This was spoken by a desperate lad seeking a home in the orphanage for boys by the name run by Jo, one of Alcott's little women, and her husband, the kind Mr. Bear. Well, this little fellow Nat was accepted, and he fit in well at Plumfield. He was a good boy, and he loved Mr. and Mrs. Bear very much. But he had one character problem. He lied at times. Mr. Bear reprimanded him for it and told him that if he did it again, he would go through a difficult punishment process. Anybody familiar with this? Know what's coming? Some of you? Okay, I know some of you have read maybe. I've never heard this, but this is pretty powerful. In fact, I hope this is not a bad idea. I mean, it's an incredible teaching tool. So the inevitable happened. Nat got in a tough spot and lied again, and Mr. Bear heard about it and summoned the penitent Nat into the school for his punishment. One of the other boys, Tommy, was peeking through a window and saw Mr. Bear taking down a big ruler. "Yikes," he said, "Nat's going to get it now." Because what would we expect to happen now? Yeah, he's going to get whooped. Now think about what we've been talking about here, and maybe you see what's coming. But this is what he saw. Mr. Bear, he asked Nat if he was ready for his punishment. Teary little Nat tries to beg off, but this was not going to happen. Then instead of asking Nat to hold out his hand, Because I guess that's what they used to do, is hit you on your, you talk about you hear the Catholic nuns that would whack you with the ruler on your hands. That ever happen? Yeah. Well, maybe did any of them do this? Instead of that, he said, this is your punishment. You have to hit my hands 6 times harder with the ruler. Can you imagine, little fellow? And the little feller's crying now, and he can't bring himself to do it because he truly loved Mr. Bear. He truly loved him, and he didn't want to hurt him. But the teacher insisted in that. Gave him a couple little taps. 1, 2. Harder, said Mr. Bear. Finally, the sobbing gnat finishes, throwing the ruler away across the room. And he was hugging the kind hand in both of his own. He laid his face down on it, sobbing out of a passion of love and shame and penitence. See, Nat had learned his lesson the hard way. And here it is on your paper. And there's a neat little coincidence. I don't know if you can tell, but point E here is a little bit bigger in the font. It says we should do everything we can to avoid hurting the one we love. Excuse me for just a moment. I should have brought this out with me. I knew it was going to happen. And what? I'm going to turn my mic off now because you're not going to want to hear this. I should have come prepared. Sandy, you said you read that before? Oh, there's a movie. Did you cry? Okay, good. I don't feel so bad. See, Nat had learned the lesson the hard way. And we likewise should do everything we can to avoid hurting the one we love. We're going to stop here. We don't have time to finish up and give this justice. Now, I will go ahead and say this. If you notice, this point here, sin violates the love of God. But I'll go ahead and give you this one thing. So you see there, sin blank, the wrath of God. You see that there in point 2? It evokes the wrath of God. That's as far as we're going to go. Now, this is powerful because we've talked about this a lot of times. What do we have here in these 2 points in relationship to God's nature? Sorry. What do we have? His holiness and love, right? The 2 ultimate aspects of his being. Love and his holiness. Now, we don't get into this right away here, but we have this idea that these 2 ultimate attributes, they exist at the same time in the same force. Is God partially holy? Is he partially love? So these 2 things are preeminent at the same time. They're both 100%. So before creation, holiness and love existed, but what didn't exist? Sin didn't exist. Okay, so sin didn't exist once creation happened and they sinned. So what happens then with love and holiness now that sin exists? There's a tension now between these two things, between God's love and holiness, a tension that has to be reconciled some way. So what happens with love in the presence of sin? Anything? It manifests as grace. Love in the presence of sin manifests as grace. Was grace present prior to sin? Was it necessary? No. Okay, so what about now about holiness in the presence of sin? What happens? It manifests as wrath. Think of it, God's holiness and wrath. It's the potential for it's there. So let's say the second that he created Adam and Eve, and they're both in existence, the potential for wrath is there, but it is not realized yet. Right? In that perfect state? So think of it like lava beneath the surface. It's there, but it's not realized until sin. Once sin occurs, then wrath erupts forth like lava. And it must be dealt with. So here we have sin devastates God in that it's a sinning, it violates the love of God, and we see that powerfully here. But also, we see that it evokes the wrath of God, and now we have tension in God's nature that has to be reconciled some way. Because God must act according to His nature. What do we call that? That's summed up, that's umbrella over that. When God acts consistently with His nature, we can put that under the umbrella of the word righteousness. Is that God always acts in accordance with His attributes. So He must respond to sin in His holiness in a certain way. In the same way, His love. So now we have tension. And so we're going to, as we move through these lessons on sin, we're going to see how these things work out. But sin violates the love of God, and sin evokes the wrath of God. And that's in the face of His holiness. All right, any questions or comments? I'm sorry for that crazy breakdown there. She was rolling her eyes. You were like, oh, here he goes again. Understanding this should help us to what? To not sin. That's the goal of this whole lesson, is understanding sin. It should help us to not sin because it hurts the one we love. Little men, and I'm assuming it's tied to little women, which is more prominent of the two, but this, I don't want to watch that little feller after him. Golly. You're a glutton for punishment. Okay, did anybody else need any other blanks? But that is a powerful thing. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Okay.